Hi, here we are again. We're just having a series of lovely conversations with some very delightful people who are going to be with us and have kindly um, accepted our invitation to speak at Viva, our guest speakers. And today we're with Ian Watson. Ian was part of the very first Viva. I can say the very first because we're now on to number 4, so it is now a tradition. And we're delighted that he's able to come back and speak to us again. And here we are with him today, and we're really just going to give him the freedom to seek to talk a little bit about what's fresh for him, and we're going to listen as avidly as we hope everyone else is. So welcome, Ian. Thanks ever so much for coming.
Thank you, Sue, and it's lovely to be back, coming back to Viva again. I'm really looking forward to it, and everybody that I've spoken to who's decided they're going is also excited about it again. As you say, I've missed the last few Vivas, but the first one was great. I had a really lovely time there. And this time, what I'm really looking forward to is just sharing what I've been working with probably since that time, I suppose, but it's really crystallized more so in the last year and a half. I got really interested in the whole field of well-being and what the understanding of the 3 principles brings to that field. And to me, it's one of those topics that on the surface it seems quite kind of obvious, and maybe there's not that much to it. But once you scratch a little deeper, you realize that it's one of those terms that's regularly used, and yet I think widely misunderstood. And when I started to investigate it, I found that, for example, that there isn't even any kind of agreement as to what it means. There isn't an accepted definition of well-being. And that people who've tried to pin it down have struggled with it for decades, including PhD psychologists who've dedicated conferences to try and figure out what well-being actually is and how do we measure it and how do we improve it. So I got quite interested in this, the fact that this thing that we talk about in the same way we talk about stress, it's in our everyday language, and yet we don't really know what we're talking about. We just use it as a blanket term. But I like the term. I think well-being to me it's an interesting term, even in terms of its etymology, the origin of it. Well, we know the word well, which has got multiple meanings, but one of its most original meanings has to do with the source, the source of water. So there's a connotation of reconnecting, going back to a source. And the being part has to do with life itself. So anything that is alive is in the process of being. And I think there's a clue in that, first of all, as to what this topic is about, because what started to become evident to me is that well-being, as I would define it, which I'll attempt to do in a minute, is a feature of life itself. And in that sense, it's not anything that we have to work on or develop, or even can work on or develop. Because if we're alive, well-being is present, essentially. And you don't have to look far to see the evidence of that. If you watch a cat or something for 24 hours, you'll see that there's not a moment when well-being is absent from that cat's life. It's operating from well-being all of the time. And if it's present for creatures such as cats, then surely it must be present for living creatures such as human beings. And yet we have this dichotomy because on the one hand, that would kind of maybe be self-evident to people. They say, well, yeah, of course, if we're born with this capacity for self-healing and self-repair and so on, and well-being must be present. But how come I don't feel well-being most of the time? And that to me is what the 3 principles of understanding helps to explain. It gives people a really good model or understanding as to why it is that they could have well-being but not necessarily feel well-being. And that, which is a really helpful thing for people to recognize. Now, what I started to see was when the researchers started to look into well-being, they got interested in, first of all, in what I would call the externals. They were measuring things like a person's external quality of life. How good are their relationships? What kind of income bracket are they in? What kind of living conditions are they living in? And they took this to be a measure of well-being. And then after a while, they started to realize it doesn't stack up. And I saw years ago that doesn't stack up. I can remember being in India, meeting people who had way less than I had, and yet they were in what I would call a state of well-being, or much closer to it than I was. And so there's an obvious non-correlation between possessions and external criteria for what we call quality of life versus feeling of well-being. Those two things don't always mesh together at all. So then the research, as it progressed over time, they started to take that into account. They say, well, we can't really measure well-being that way because there's too many exceptions. There's a lot of people on low incomes and all the rest of it who actually display a high degree of well-being, and vice versa. So when they start to look at the internal criteria, say, well, it must be some kind of a feeling state, or it has to do with whether the person's mostly in a positive state of mind, or whether they have a certain amount of confidence and capability to make decisions, these kind of things. Can we communicate clearly? So these became the measurable variables, if you like, which would help psychologists to determine whether well-being was prevalent or whether it was absent or diminished. And again, they found that it was only true up to a point. And what is really interesting to see the progression in the thinking of the research, that they've been kind of getting closer, you could say, to what's really true about it, but still unable to really pin it down. And one of the analogy that came to mind for me is it's a bit like trying to, if you say to someone, talk to me about the weather, about your understanding of weather, but I don't want you to say anything about snow or sunshine or rain or wind or any of the manifest forms of weather. You can't mention any of those. Just talk to me about the weather. Well, there wouldn't be much we could say about it. And I started to see that well-being is in that category. It's something which is always present, but all we can talk about are the manifest, let's say, the visible forms, the visible forms and shapes that it takes. And this is why I think the researchers have had such trouble with it. It's like this elusive something. They know that there's something there, but the only thing they can measure are the variables, which are the measurable things. Yeah, the things to do with quality of life and quality of life experience. Those are measurable variables. What I started to see, my insight around this, if you like, that helped me was to realize well-being itself is not a variable. It's a constant. Once I saw that was the game changer for me. I was like, oh God, that's what they're not seeing. And this might be no news to you guys, I'm sure, but it was, I suppose I had to come to it through my own investigation. Once I started to see that's the problem, that's what we're up against. When we treat something which is a constant as if it's a variable, we're starting from the wrong place. And one misunderstanding leads to another, if you like. Once you kind of back up a little bit, you say, well, let's treat it as a constant. What happens from that place? If we start from the assumption that well-being is ever present in every living thing, then all we need is an understanding as to why it doesn't look like that. And then we've got a good working model. We've got a solid working foundation, which you can have a conversation about well-being with anyone. And I found once I started to articulate it that way, I could speak to people who work in mental health field, for example, and now they could understand what I was trying to get a sense, trying to point to, because it makes sense to people when you reflect that to them. It makes sense that well-being is something that's intrinsic to life, but you have to take into account people's experience, which is that they don't always feel good on the inside, and often they feel not good for long periods of time. So if you help them to understand, well, yeah, that's true too, because we have this thought feeling system, which is a variable. Yeah, that's a measurable variable. But right behind that, all of those different forms are being created from a place of well-being. And that's understandable to people. So that's been my topic of interest, which that's the kind of thing I spend sleepless nights wondering about. I don't know about you guys, but I've just been kind of teasing my way into it and seeing, what is it that's been missed and what is it that's so far been misunderstood. But I think if we are to really bring something helpful to the table, which I know for a fact that the 3 principles of understanding can do, I think we have to find ways of articulating it which are not only accessible but are grounded in truth. It's got to be really solid. And I started to see there were ways in which I was sloppy with my articulation. I was talking about well-being in a way that implied that it was variable, and I realized that that's not right. That's misleading for people. So I've had to kind of clean up my act a little bit.
Brilliant. I love the way that you just laid it all out on the table, if you like, so that for me that's what it felt like. It felt like you just laid it all on the table and helped me see something in the principles world. I suppose a lot of, I would see as innate health.
Yes,
you're talking about innate health. There's well-being, and well-being is such a, as you say, a commonly used term by so many in the helping field.
It is, but most is misunderstood.
As you said, there's so much misunderstanding around it. And if we starting with a false premise, I love that, Ian. I love what you've uncovered there. That's really helpful.
Yeah, most of the existing dialogue around it is still talking about what can we do to improve well-being. Mm-hmm. And as soon as a person talks about trying to improve well-being, they've started from a place of misunderstanding. Because not only can you not improve it, it doesn't need improving. There's nothing there to improve. So that to me is a really, really helpful thing for us to recognize, those of us who are involved in this work. But also it helps our sharing. That's what I'm finding. It helps to be able to share with people who don't yet have the understanding of the principles. If we start on a firm, like a really clear foundation, it seems to me that they can go there with us much more readily. They're less likely to ask the questions which are, which display a misunderstanding, let's say. If you don't start from misunderstanding, it doesn't lead to more misunderstanding. That's a long-winded way of putting it.
Well, it was the clarity there, I think, is fantastic. And I think that really is a helpful explication of the foundations that we're it's a 180-degree turn almost, isn't it? It's from outside to inside, or it's from facing this way to facing the other way. And it's really not a difficult move to make, but you have to hear it for it to go, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. And then everything else slots into place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know it's not news to you folks, because we all work in this field. And in a way, it wasn't an absolute revelation to me either, because you're right, I've been using this term innate health and so on for quite a while. But there was still something about this well-being piece that I hadn't really I hadn't seen it as clearly as I see it now. So that's an ongoing investigation for me. And it's something that I'd love to just share my journey in that at the Viva conference. And probably by the time it comes around, I might have something hopefully even fresher to say about it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful discussion, and I've really enjoyed listening to it. I was thinking, hang on a minute, keep your wits about you, girl. Don't go off into a reverie of your own. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll cut it here, I think. Sheila, you happy with that? And and just a big vote of thanks to you. And we're really looking forward to spending some time with you. Not just listening, but probably, strolling in the sunshine.
That's the bit I'm looking forward to.
And I'm looking forward to having a bit of a dance too.
Oh yes. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.